Tonight, I want to take you back to a conversation that Jesus had with his disciples. And I want to take you back to a moment when the disciples were walking with Jesus by the temple. And as they were doing that, they pointed Jesus to this magnificent structure of the temple. This was, by the way, Herod's temple. It was a architectural feat, and it was a beautiful building. But Jesus made a statement that kind of hit them in the chest, so to speak, because he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say unto you, not how many? Not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be" what? Not be thrown down. Now, I don't know if you know this. The temple in Jerusalem was actually comprised of different sized stones. But some of those stones, some of the single stones, weighed up to 6,000 pounds. So in other words, the building itself was comprised of like custom stonework, and some of these stones were gigantic in size. Now, when Jesus said this, the disciples understood that something that could cause such total devastation. So, I'm using the word raze as an R-A-Z-E, but something that could raze a building completely level, something that could destroy a building of this size, in their minds, this had to be like cataclysmic. This had to be like the end of the world type of a scenario. So when Jesus said this, the disciples were just stunned. They were shocked. By the way, if you ever get a chance and you go to Italy, if you go to Rome, there is an actual structure that commemorates this event. It's called the Arch of Titus. If you study your history, you will learn that two generals from Rome, Cestius and later Titus, they sieged Jerusalem. And when they sieged it, Titus was fortunate to be able to plunder the temple before it burnt up. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But they plundered the temple, and one of the things that they took out of it, this is inscribed on relief on this Arch of Titus, was the 7-branch candlestick. If you look in the Bible, this was actually made of pure gold during Solomon's reign. What's fascinating about this is that what Jesus predicted when he said not one stone would be left upon another, what Jesus predicted actually came true. How do we know? Well, first of all, when the Romans besieged Jerusalem, there was strict orders given. He said, whatever you do, the general Titus said, whatever you do, don't set the temple on fire. Well, during the heat of the battle, and we don't know, the historian, I think Herodotus, tells us that someone threw a burning like torch into the temple. And the temple, though it was constructed of stone, it had a great deal of very, very old cedar wood inside of it. And I think you know the scenario. The cedar wood was like, it was just like, a match to hay. And so basically it combusted, it burned. And guess what? In all of that stonework, among the artifacts or the temple furniture, there was actually a lot of gold. And guess what? The gold started, in that fire, in that raging inferno, the gold started to melt. Guess where it went? It seeped into the stonework of the temple. As it seeped into these cracks and these crevices, this burning temple became like the centerpiece of this massive onslaught from the Romans and the Jews. But when the temple finally stopped burning and everything subsided, looters came into the city by night. Guess what they were looking for? They were looking for gold. And so you know what they had to do to get to it? They literally pried apart the stonework to get at the gold. And so when Jesus predicted this event, it actually came true sometime in the year 70 AD. Now, the disciples, they were stunned. They were confounded by this statement of Jesus. Keep in mind that what Jesus had predicted, they had not yet seen it fulfilled. And so they wanted to know, in their minds, they thought, okay, whatever does this kind of destruction, this has got to be divine judgment. This has to be the end of the world. So notice their question. They said, tell us, when will these things be? And what shall be the sign of what? Your coming, and what else? The end of the age. See, the disciples made the assumption whatever could destroy the temple, such a magnificent large building, whatever could destroy it completely like this, It had to be the end of the world. Well, fortunately, that wasn't the case, because if it was so, we wouldn't be here. That would have all ended in the year AD 70. But Jesus knew that the events which led up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 would be very similar to things that would happen right before the end of the world. And so, in answering their question, Jesus wove these two events, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and events that would proceed right before the end of the world. He wove them together in one answer, which is recorded in Matthew chapter 24. It's called the Olivet Discourse. And as we look at this tonight, I want you to notice that as soon as they ask the question, Jesus, tell us, what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the world? The first thing that Jesus tells them, he doesn't give them a sign. Instead, he says, take heed that no one what? Deceives you. In fact, that's the very first thing that he says. He says, many will come in my name saying, I am Christ, I am the Christ, and will what? Deceive many. Now, I want to make a point here. When the disciples said, Jesus, tell us what will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the world, Jesus, the first thing that he said is, be careful, because people will come to try to do what? Deceive you. That was the first thing that Jesus warned them about. Then Jesus begins to give them some signs, and I want you to notice what he said. He said, you will hear about what? Wars, and what else? Rumors of war. And he said, look, don't be troubled. All of these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Now, I want to pause. Let's review what we've read so far. We've basically tonight read from Matthew 24, verse 2, all the way down to verse 7. And the sequence goes like this. Jesus says the temple will be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. The disciples said, whoa, when is this going to happen? Tell us what the end of the world will be like and the signs right before your coming. Then Jesus says, don't be deceived. And then he says, you're going to see nation rise up against nation. There will be wars and rumors of war. And then he lists some of these other things, which we'll go into in just a moment. Now, some of you are sitting here, and maybe you're watching this on video, and you're saying, that's not a sign. There have always been wars. In fact, if you are a student of the Bible, you know wars basically arose almost as soon as the record of human history. So as we look at this, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that Jesus makes a statement to put this all in context. He says all of these things that he mentioned as signs are the beginning of, what's that word there on the screen? Sorrows. Now, I want to just make a point here. In English, the word sorrows is actually taken from the original Greek word, which is odin. I want to show this to you tonight. But the word odin is basically a word that could be translated. It's translated in this version as sorrows, but it could be translated as the birth pains. Now, ladies, if you have given birth, you know what that means exactly. And men, if you are married to someone that gave birth, you know about this. Before a woman gives birth, something happens. These contractions that they experience, they get closer together and more what? More intense, right? More frequent and more intense, isn't that right? And so you know that she's about to give birth, or ladies, you know that you're about to give birth because you know that those contractions are getting stronger and they're getting closer together. Jesus said, these signs, these wars and rumors of war, famines, pestilence, earthquakes, all of these would be like birth pains. In other words, as we get closer to the end of time, they will become more frequent and more intense. If that's clear, could you just say amen? Okay, now tonight I want to talk a little bit about how big are these contractions, these birth pains that the Bible talks about. Well, one of the things that you need to know is that right now, Jesus has given us, from what we've just read, roughly 3 types of signs, okay? He's given us signs that would be in the religious world because he said, there will be people that will come in my name saying that they are Christ and they will deceive many. The second thing that he told us is that there would be political signs. There would be wars and rumors of war. And then he also said there would be signs in the natural world. He said there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places. So tonight I want to focus on these 3 sections of signs that Jesus talked about. Jesus didn't say a few. He said what? Many will come in my name saying I am the Christ and will do what? Deceive many. Now, I'm going to make a point here that may not make sense to you, but you can check me on this. In the original both Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, there are no punctuation marks. Punctuation was actually added by the translators to try to clarify in their minds what they perceive the verse to mean. But if you look at this verse and you remove all of the punctuation, this is an important point that I want to make. It's true that some people would come and they would claim to be the Christ. I'm going to show you some of those people in just a moment. But if you remove the punctuation, another way to look at this is some people would come saying that Jesus is the Messiah, but would still deceive people. Do you understand the difference? Now, whichever view we take, what Jesus predicted has definitely come true, because he said, for false Christs and false what? Prophets shall arise and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Now, I'm going to give you some examples. This is obviously not an exhaustive list. I don't know if any of you have heard of Moon Sang-myun. Okay, now, if you haven't, don't worry. But he is actually a South Korean, and this is probably not the best time to introduce this, but my heritage is actually from South Korea, okay? But I just, look, no relation, no connection there, but I just wanted to just mention that. So here is this man, Sun Myung-moon, or Moon Sang-myung, and this man actually has said, this is a true fact, he's actually claimed that he is the incarnation of Jesus again on the earth. Now, I don't know if you know this, but this guy has thousands of followers around the world. And they don't just worship him, they give him all their money. I mean, it's a very interesting idea, but don't miss this. He's claiming to be the reincarnation of Jesus. Did Jesus predict there would be false Christ, yes or no? Absolutely. I don't know if you remember the story of Charles Manson. Now, some of you will, if you're up in popular culture today, you know that recently Hollywood released a movie that kind of centered on this, right? And if you know the background, basically what Charles Manson did is he incited his followers to kill a famous actress because he wanted the group to gain notoriety. In reality, what he wanted to start a race war. Like, this was his whole motivation. But what's very interesting is that Manson also had a messianic kind of appeal to his followers. I don't know if you were aware that even as not that long ago, some woman was trying to marry Charles Manson. I don't know if you are aware of some of the history that's more recently developed. Some of you remember back in the 1970s, in San Francisco, there was a religious organization called the People's Temple. It was led by a charismatic individual by the name of Jim Jones. And ultimately what happened is Jim created like a little, supposed to be utopia out in Guyana, and they called it Jonestown. But things started getting out of hand, and we don't know if it's directly connected, but at some point it became unmanageable. And then he told everybody to drink a drink that was laced with cyanide, and hundreds of people died. Now, what's very tragic is there was actually a woman in the group that actually stood up and protested. She said, guys, Jesus wouldn't do this. Like, this is wrong. Like, Jesus would not ask us to do this. Nobody listened to her, and everyone perished. Now, another example, more modern than that. Some of you remember a guy by the name of David Koresh. Do you remember him? That wasn't his real name. So he chose the name David after King David in the Bible. The name Koresh is actually a modern, a modernization of the name Cyrus. And both of those names in Scripture have Christological typology, meaning they in some way point to Jesus. So he claimed, I know this sounds strange, but he claimed that the first Jesus was sinless, and he claimed that he was the sinful Jesus. He was going to experience every sin for mankind and plumb the depths of sin. That's what he actually claimed. I know that you know that his whole cult and that whole compound ended up in a fiery fiasco. I don't know if you also remember this gentleman, Marshall Applewhite. There was a Comet Hale-Bopp. He taught his followers that there was a spaceship in the tail of that comet, and to get on board, you had to shed your earthly body, and then you would end up on the spaceship. So you know how they did it? They took phenobarbital. They all overdosed. They even put plastic bags over their heads. And then 26 people killed themselves. And this was because of the false teachings of this man. Now, do you realize that these were very, very clear fulfillments of people that claimed some type of messianic or Christological, they had these aspirations, and yet they had deceived people to the point of leading them to death. Paul writes in 2 Timothy that in the last days, perilous times would come, for men would be lovers of themselves, having a form of what? Now, I'm going to underscore this because when Paul writes about the last days, he's talking about Christians here. How do I know? Because they have a form of what? Godliness. You know what that means? It means they're pretending to be spiritual. Do you catch that? Secular people don't pretend that, right? They're living their, hedonistic lifestyles. But this is talking about Christians. They have a form of godliness, but they deny its power. And this is actually, we're seeing the unfolding of this right now in our country. If you really look carefully, by the way, there is a survey group, the Barna Group. They conduct spiritual surveys. And they actually examined, and I think they surveyed just Christians on 4 essential questions. So here was the first question. They asked them, would you agree with the statement, God is the all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe who rules the world today? So simple question, do you accept this principle as being true? And only 78% said yes. Now remember, the survey was only for Christians, which means only 3 out of 4 Christians today believes that God is the all-powerful creator. That might not be a shock to you, but let me share with you the second point. They asked these Christians, just Christians, is Satan real? Or is he just a symbol of evil? In other words, is there really a devil? That was the question they were asking. Did you know that 59% agreed to this idea that there is no Satan, it's only just a representation of evil? That's almost half, like 1 out of 2. That's alarming. And then they asked a third question, did Jesus sin while he was living on earth? Now, I don't know how familiar you are with popular media, but there was a movie by, I think his director's name was Kazansakis. He made a film called The Last Temptation of Christ, and maybe that was an influence, but did you know that 40% of the viewers believed, or the surveyed believed, that Jesus had sinned while he was on earth? I don't know if you know the implications of that. If that's true, everything we're doing makes no sense, like no point, okay? And then the fourth question that they asked was, is the Holy Spirit a real being, or is it just is it a symbol of God's power? Basically it's just this presence, but it's not really a separate member of the Godhead. And you know what? 58% of Christians said, yes, Holy Spirit isn't a being, it's just presence. Now, why am I sharing this with you? Paul's prediction was right when he said that at the end of time, people would have a form of what? Godliness. Like, in other words, it would just look like they were Christians, but the truth is that in reality, they were pretty far from the tenets of what Christianity really believed. Let's move on tonight, but we've talked about some of the religious signs. Let's talk about some of the political signs that Jesus predicted. He said, you will hear of wars, rumors of war. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in the 1800s, there was a philosopher by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche. And this Friedrich Nietzsche, he made the statement, he said, God is dead, and if people accept this idea that God is dead, then the 20th century will be the most bloody century of all. And guess what? His words came true. Did you know that just in the 20th century alone, over 200 million people died as a result of warfare? And that's a staggering number of people. I don't know if you are, to put that in perspective, the population of the United States is like 380 million. So this is like over half of the population of the United States. Did you know that as we're sitting in this room right now tonight, around the world, right now, there are roughly 40 armed conflicts. You know why I said 40? Because Afghanistan stopped. And when we wrote this, Afghanistan was still going, okay? But there's like roughly 40, and there's a Wikipedia page that monitors all the active war zones in the world right now. And not just that, but when you go and look at all of these countries, you know there's like 196 countries that are recognized by the United Nations. Out of those 196, 193 have disputes. It may not be an armed conflict, but border disputes or some kind of territorial dispute with other countries. Right now, there are 8 countries in the world that we know of that have nuclear capabilities. 8. And I'm pretty sure you know them. It's the big 8. But did you know that they have enough nuclear weapons stockpiled? They could destroy this entire world to eliminate all human life 50 times, and it would only take less than an hour. I don't know if you understand the staggering amount of power that we have amassed humankind with as far as the power to kill and to destroy. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about the predictions that the Bible makes about the economic situation at the end of time. It says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten." Now look closely. "Your gold and silver are" what? "Corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the" what times? "In the last days." Now, this statement is very telling. And the reason I say this is some of you will know that gold doesn't rust, right? Silver, pure silver will corrode, but for the sake of the verse, gold doesn't rust. But let's just say, just for illustration's sake, let's say you had a vault full of gold bars, and one day you open your vault, and all of a sudden, like all the gold that you had amassed, it's rusted and it's just in dust. What happened to your wealth? What happened to it? It's gone. It just evaporated, right? That's exactly what the Bible was talking about. It's talking about people at the end of time, because notice it says you've heaped together treasure for the last days. It's talking about the sudden devaluation of wealth. Did we see that? Yeah, look back just a few years, 2008. You had millionaires that became thousandaires, isn't that right? Why? It's not that, they didn't have gold. It was just all, fiat currency, so to speak. But the idea was that these people's wealth, it suddenly devalued, right? And look, you and I both know, some of these bankers and some of these people, like they jumped out of their windows because the wealth that they had amassed suddenly just evaporated like the dew in the morning sun. This is a very, very interesting illustration of the times that we're living in right now. But I want to talk to you about the third category of signs that Jesus gave, because he predicted that there would be signs in nature. I want you to notice what he said. He said there will be what? Famines, pestilences, and what else? Earthquakes in various places. Now, I want to tell you something. Even as we're sitting here tonight, most of us are not aware of the world hunger statistics. I admit to you that I was very surprised as I prepared for this presentation this evening, because I realized that unbeknownst to us, even as we're just here sitting in the comfort of this room, there are people all around the world that are struggling just to survive. Did you know that every 6 seconds a child dies from starvation? And you can look this up. There are so many websites that give the statistics about world hunger, so it's not hard to find this. Do you realize that there are actually over 1 billion people? They have food to eat, but just because you have food, it does not mean that you're getting proper nutrition. You understand the difference, right? So there are literally 1 billion people in the world right now that are struggling. I'm not going to read all these statistics, but it's shocking to understand what is happening in the world today. But I want to talk to you also about the epidemiological landscape. Now, that's just a word that talks about diseases, because Jesus said that before he comes, there would be famines and pestilences. The Greek word for pestilences is literally the word plague, okay? So if you look on the screen, the diseases that you see mentioned there are either new or they're old things that have become suddenly untreatable. If you're a nurse or if you're in the medical profession, you know this. Diseases are becoming, well, bacterial infections are becoming more and more resistant to antibiotics. Is that true, yes or no? That's true. I think most of you, if you work in the medical industry, you will know that. Do you see that tuberculosis is there? Did you know that several years ago, there was a growing concern that in some parts of the world, tuberculosis is back and they can't control it? I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a little bit. And I don't need to tell you that now there are respiratory infections. I listed SARS here, and I'm going to talk about COVID in just a moment. But these are diseases that didn't seem so prominent on the landscape of disease, but now in more recent times have become significant factors in the health of millions of people. Okay, so this is about the things. But I want to shift gears here now to talk to you a little bit about earthquakes, because Jesus said there would be famines, pestilences, and then he said there would be earthquakes. So there was an individual that went into a geological library, and he actually wanted to compile some data on how many major earthquakes there have been in times past. Now, when we talk about major, you know, the seismograph is a modern invention, the Richter scale, right? But we're talking about earthquakes that were so notable in history that people died and buildings collapsed. That's the kind of earthquake. So they started researching this, and this is what they found. From the 1st to the 3rd century, there was one earthquake that's notable, just one, okay? And it's recorded. A lot of people died, you know, buildings collapsed. And then in the 3rd through the 5th, there was 2. Now, keep in mind, there was no Richter scale back then. So you have to understand that we're looking at things that historians mention. Wow, this was an earthquake. And you got to think, if a historian mentions it, that must have been something. And then you go to the 5th through the 8th century, there was one. 8th through the 9th, or 10th. And then when you get to the 11th through the 13th, you have 2. But then, as you keep progressing in this scale, you notice the pattern. It's like there's 1, there's 2, and you have to think, these cover sometimes as much as 300 years. But when you get to the 16th century, suddenly there's 7. And then you get to the 17th century, and there's 13. And then you get to the 19th century, and there's 26. And you get to the 20th century, and then there's 130. And I know you know this, we're in the 21st century. The most powerful earthquake on record that we had measured, and when I say measured, like, you know, Richter scale, was the 2004 earthquake. It was a 9.3, and it lasted for 10 minutes. Over 300,000 people died as a result of that one earthquake. It was the first earthquake to be felt by every seismograph on Earth. And you know, what's interesting about it is that there are literally now thousands of earthquakes every year that are over a 7 on the Richter scale. Now, not all of them are felt on major continents. Some of them are deep in the ocean. But there's no denying this. Seismic activity has gone up exponentially. Now, the question that I want to pose to you tonight is, how close are we? In other words, how big are these contractions that Jesus talked about? I know you will probably remember where you were when the World Trade Center fell. I'm sure you remember that, because I remember that. There's something about momentous events in history where if we're there, if we're alive, we know where we were. And you know, that was really a significant moment in history because it launched several major wars. Did you hear how much money the war in Afghanistan cost? Did you remember this? I understand that it was like, and I hope I'm not over-exaggerating this, but I checked my notes. This thing costed $1 billion a month. Do you understand how much money that is? $1 billion a month. That's how much this costed. Do you remember the Enron energy scandal? You know, there was a book, I just read an excerpt, The Smartest Guys in the Room, and it's all about how the energy industry these guys got corrupt and they started doing things that were unethical. And then we saw the collapse of that organization. Some of you know that we learned, so when it was Kim Il-sung, when he was in power, he had these little puny rockets. They couldn't get, the solid fuel thing going. And then finally, they learned how to master the technology of, multiple stage rockets. Guess what? Now, North Korea has the possibility to hit any target in any part of the world. And one thing about these North Koreans, they don't think the war ended. I don't know if you know that. In their mind, they're still at war with the South, and obviously its allies, which one of them is us. Now, you know about the war in Iraq. I think most of you know that we thought by getting rid of Saddam, that would bring some modicum of peace to that region. Guess what? We have a new problem now. That problem is called ISIS, right? Did you know ISIS has an interesting agenda? I don't know if you've ever read this, but ISIS actually wants to start a war that will lead to the final conflict. They believe that in this final conflict, and you can check me on this, that it's going to center in Rome and Jesus is going to help ISIS. Yeah, I know some of you are sitting here befuddled, like how in the world? But these groups have some very interesting ideologies of how they believe these wars play into an end time apocalyptic scenario. You remember the SARS outbreak? Okay, some of you do, some of you don't. It was like a blip on the news because it was bigger overseas. It was bigger in Hong Kong, it was big in Canada. But this was a turning point because some countries today were prepared for COVID because of SARS. In other words, because of the SARS pandemic, they were ready to try to control their nations as to prevent the spread of this disease. But it was a significant milestone in the development of disease control. Now, do you remember, I forget the exact year, I think it was like 2011 when we had that big brownout in the Northeast, New York. Remember the hot summers where, parts of the grid couldn't handle the load? And so now we figured out, this pointed out that many parts of the country, we have aging infrastructure. Some of these power plants, some of these, the lines and all of these things, they're like 70 years old and they're aging, and we're starting to see that, guess what? This beautiful place that we live in may not be as solid. It's maybe built on like a house of cards. All this could come crumbling down if someone targets the right things. I mentioned earlier about the Southeast Asian tsunami, one of the most powerful earthquakes and subsequent devastating tsunamis that in recent times, 9.4 on the Richter scale. But then 2005, do you remember like when they would name hurricanes, like you had Hurricane Ella and then, all these different names. In 2005, they ran out of letters to name these hurricanes because there was so many. There was 27 on record. And I'm sure some of you will still remember the devastation that Hurricane Katrina caused. There are still places where the devastation has not been repaired. And then I know that you also remember about Iran wanting a nuclear weapon, and this is an ongoing thing. I don't know if you know about Stuxnet and the whole effort by the Israelis to try to sabotage the Iranian nuclear program. The point is that Iran literally wants to wipe Israel off the map, and they're in a constant quest to develop and gain nuclear weapons. And then you probably remember in 2008, we had the massive global recession. Do you know right now, I'm sure you are aware that China has been rocked. Its financial sector has been rocked by some major corporations that have failed. Are you aware of the Evergrande collapse? Even if you're not, I want to just mention that these recessions, they run in cycles. And I'm not trying to scare anybody, but they say that typically they run in like 7-year cycles, which means like we are overdue, and they say the next one that's going to come is going to be a big, big problem. Now, again, I'm not trying to, you can just read this. Like, this is definitely not anything sensational. Right now, China is built on a bubble, and soon that bubble will pop. And when it does, everyone's connected. Like, all of us are all connected in this new globalized economy. I'm sure that some of you, and we had some folks from Haiti earlier today, but Haiti actually had some massive earthquakes that caused major devastation. And these earthquakes, I mean, it's just tragic when you see how many lives are lost, poor infrastructure, poor building codes, and so forth. Do you remember the Deepwater Horizon spill? Do you remember that, they were churning out, I forget the exact number, but it was like millions of gallons of oil. And this thing happened for, several months. And you know what? They say that even now, if you go into the Gulf of Mexico, you can still find balls of tar washing up on the shore as the byproduct of Deepwater Horizon. Some of you are aware about the Arab Spring and, Syria. Okay, so Syria kills 120,000 people. All of these, the government kills their own people, and then the massive exodus, and that's still ongoing. This whole crisis that happened there in the Middle East. Maybe some of you remember the Japanese 9.0 earthquake that caused the Fukushima reactor to burst. And I'm not a scientist, but some sites say that there is still radiation that's like leaking into the ocean, and it's becoming spread out, and you can find traces of it in fish that migrate between the west coast of America and the east coast of Japan. Whether or not that's true, the point is that there are some very unsettling events that happened. Oh, I think I overstepped myself when I talked about Syria, but let's talk about Hurricane Sandy. Do you remember this? Hurricane Sandy caused so much devastation. There's places in New York that still haven't been fixed. I don't know if you know that. It was a devastating hurricane. I mentioned when I talked about the diseases, there is an outbreak of tuberculosis in some parts of the world that's untreatable. And that's alarming because I'm sure you know, like tuberculosis is very contagious and it can be fatal. So that's cause for alarm. Here's another disturbing fact. We don't know why. Some people have said it's 5G. I'm not going to talk about 5G in the seminar, okay? But the point is that bees are dying at alarming rates. And you guys know this, right? If bees die, what else dies? Yeah, plants die, right? And if plants die, that affects human beings, right? So there's an interesting connection there that's happening. The Philippine typhoon, I think it was hurricane or typhoon, I forgot the name of it. This was devastating. This was one of the worst storms on record in the Philippines. It caused massive death, massive loss of life, and massive damage. Ebola, very interesting. So I had visited Congo before, and Congo, Sierra Leone, several of these, Liberia, these countries had an outbreak. You know that Ebola's death rate, if you contract it, like the death rate for COVID is actually pretty small. But Ebola's death rate, if you contract it, it's like over 50%. It's very, very lethal, and it's a deadly disease, and it keeps popping back up. Do you remember the birth defect causing virus called Zika? Do you remember this? Very prominent in Brazil and some of these other countries where you see these children born that are, they're damaged because of this virus. And okay, we talked a little bit about ISIS. I mentioned that earlier. Do you remember the Las Vegas shooting? Do you remember this? Do you remember how 58 concert goers got mowed down by a guy who was shooting from the hotel? And I don't need to tell you this because you already know. It's like every 2 months in the United States, there is another work or school place shooting. Have you noticed that? It's not like a timetable, but it's almost like every 2 months in the news, there's another public shooting somewhere, okay? So what's happening? We're seeing that the world is becoming more and more unstable. Right now, we are sitting in the midst of a global pandemic. Isn't this true? This is probably one of the most eye-opening events because I'll be honest, I've never, there was the flu back in the early part of the 1900s, and then there was smallpox. We are the generation that is seeing the outbreak of coronavirus. And this is really a very, very, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it's like an experience that, when I was growing up, I kind of enjoyed not going to school because of snow or other inclement weather. There are kids that have missed whole years of school because of the pandemic. This is a very, very unheard of and unprecedented event. So the question comes back to us, well, what time is it? Really, what's happening on planet Earth? I want you to notice what Jesus predicted in that same chapter. He said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached where? In all the world as a what? As a witness to all nations, and then what will happen? The end will come. Folks, this is probably the most encouraging sign that Jesus gave in this discourse on Mount Olivet. Because as we're sitting here tonight, we are seeing the fulfillment of this exact prophecy that Jesus gave. Did you know that right now in Africa, Christianity is growing at an exponential rate? There are many, many countries where they're seeing an explosion of interest in Christianity. Not just that, but in South America, it's growing 4 times faster than the population. Some of the largest Christian churches in the world, please listen to this, some of the largest Christian churches in the world are now found in China. It's also exploding in India, okay? And what's happening? Why is this happening? Because Jesus predicted that before he comes, one of the signs that would let us know is that the gospel would be preached where? In all the world, and that's happening today. I want you to notice what Jesus said about childbirth. He said, a woman, when she is in labor, has sorrow because her hour has come. But as soon as she has given birth to the child, she no longer remembers the what? The anguish. Folks, do you realize that right now we are in the midst of the birth pains, right? That's where we are right now. All of the things that I shared with you tonight, these are all evidences of what Jesus predicted would take place right before he comes. But make no mistake, friends, as we see all of these things that are happening right now, as we see all of the upheaval and all of the conflict and all of these things happening in the world, you've got to remember that all that Jesus said, as it comes to pass, it will culminate in a beautiful event, because Jesus said, for the joy that a human being has been born into the world. Therefore, you now have sorrow, but I will see you again, and your heart will what? Rejoice, and your joy no one will take from you. Do you realize what Jesus is talking about? Is he's talking about his return. He's saying that all of the things that we have to go through, all the conflict, the disease, and all of the political and religious and natural science, all of these things, these are the birth pains. But friends, let me tell you, when Jesus comes, when the sky splits open and Jesus with the angels comes, you're going to forget all of the heartache and all of the sorrow and all of the stress. You're going to forget all of that. Why? Because Jesus has finally come. I want to tell you, we can be ready for Jesus to come today. Because we don't have to say, by the way, in the Bible, it's very clear. Jesus never tells us exactly when he's going to come. In fact, Jesus said, no man knows the day or the hour. And I've had some of my guests that have come and say, but we'll know the year. No, Jesus actually said, you will not know the times of the seasons. Now, let me share with you, there's a reason why Jesus doesn't tell us the day, the hour, or the year. There's a reason why. It's called human nature. You know what human nature will do? Let's say that you knew Jesus was going to come, and I'm not saying he will, but let's say you knew that Jesus was going to come in November of 2022. You know what most people would do? They would party like no tomorrow until October. That's just human nature. Do you get it? We always put off for tomorrow what we should do right now. So you know what Jesus does? He doesn't tell us because he wants us to always be in a state of what? Readiness. And I want to make this invitation to you tonight because some of you may be thinking, you know what? I'm not ready. What would keep you? What would prevent you from being ready for Jesus to come? Maybe there's some cherished sin in your life. Maybe there's something that you're holding on to that you know keeps you from being ready. Friends, I want to tell you, everything that we go through in this life, all the heartache, all the pain, all of that will be forgotten in a moment when we see Jesus come. I want to challenge you, nothing is worth missing out on that event. And as we close this evening, I want to invite you to bow your heads with me. Let us prepare ourselves for what is coming by having faith in Jesus. Father in heaven, tonight, We've talked about the signs of the end. There is definitely a planet in upheaval. We've seen these signs, we've seen these things, and we're seeing them right now. Lord, I know that in this room tonight and watching, there are people that long for Jesus to come. I know that there might also be people that they want to meet Jesus, but they know that their lives aren't ready. Lord, help them. Give them courage. Help them to be willing to give up anything that might separate them from being ready to meet Jesus when he comes. Lord, please continue to guide us in the study of prophecy in this series, Discovering Revelation, for we ask these things in Jesus' name we pray.